guys, and welcome back. You know, online on some of the woodworking forums, some of you follow some of my builds of various projects, and I really do appreciate that. My latest project, of course, is this thing right here, and I'm at the stage now where I'm ready to make the tires for it. And for something a little different on this week's show, I thought that maybe some of you out there might be interested in the process it takes to actually make these wheels. Just so you can see they don't just get thrown together. So with that being said, making wheels on a toy Jeep. This is the part in the video where I confuse everybody because no one has a clue what I'm talking about. But hopefully by the end of this video it'll become clear what I said at this point in time, and it'll all come together. I don't script these videos, I just kind of fly by the seat of my pants, so hopefully this is going to work. Anyway, the premise of making these wheels is that you would cut a disc, and in this case I'm just using a peanut butter lid as an example for demonstration purposes. And the object of these particular wheels is to cut the treads of the wheels. And for this particular type of tire, we need to angle the tire like this over top of a router with a certain type of bit in the router. And from there it is slid over top of the router bit, stopped at a certain point in order to cut the one tread in the tire. Then the tire is rotated ever so slightly by X amount of degrees, and I'll go through all that a little later, and then a second cut is made, and then it's rotated, third cut, fourth cut, fifth cut, so on till the tires have their treads. So we're going to start off by using some scrap plywood, and I'm going to square this all off, and we're going to make a jig that we can use on the router table to cut these wheels. I've got my main pieces cut for the jig for these wheels, and as with any jig, guys, if you're going to make a jig, take the time to do the angle cuts properly. Take the time to check that things are square, because the purpose of a jig is for repeatability. The purpose of a jig is in order to repeat the same process accurately every time. But if your jig isn't square, then all you're repeating is inaccuracies. So with that in mind, be sure that you're cutting pieces for your jigs on proper angles and square. So anyway, the general assembly of this jig will be something to this effect, where these two 30-degree angle pieces will be assembled in the front, just like this, and they'll be attached to this board, which also has the 30 degrees cut out of it. So they'll be attached here, and this particular piece will be in the front. Now, this piece that's here in the front is the one where your wheel will ride into the router. But I'm not going to glue this together just yet or drill things out just yet, only because I now need to cut the discs in order to make my wheels out of, because I need to know how low the wheel is going to go and how it's going to sit flush on the router table down at the bottom here. I really don't know at this point in time where to drill that hole that will hold the bolt that will hold the wheel. So with that being said, we're going to leave this for now, and we're going to go cut some pieces for our tires. These wheels that I'm making for the Jeep, I'm making out of walnut. So I've done the resaw and done the thickness planing down to 5/8 of an inch. That's the thickness of these particular tires. And now I need to take it over to the drill press and cut, let me think what I need here, 5, 6, 7 2 7/8 of an inch discs. And what I'll be using to cut them is one of these. if you've never used one of these, let me just introduce you to a closer view of your opponent. This is the undefeated knuckle-busting champion of the world. And I am telling you that if you don't keep an eye on this baby and keep an eye on where your knuckles are in comparison to where this thing is spinning, you are going to be on the ground in the fetal position crying like a little schoolgirl in about 2.4 seconds. So, we're going to go over and cut these wheels, but keep your knuckles in check. And remember, your opponent here takes no prisoners. I just wanted to show you guys the setup of what I do here in order to protect myself from the knuckle buster. And here we have the fence of my drill press, and I have it set at the proper distance here for the center point to drill each one of these holes. Now I can hold this board over here. The fence is going to help me hold it, and at no point in time should I have to get my hands anywhere near this center. Even when I'm drilling further down, I'm still way out of the way, and then of course as I get too close, I can switch hands holding it and put it over here, or just spin the board around so that I still have as much over here to keep my hands away from the knuckle buster here. So I don't have it set up right now because it would get away in the way of the video, but I will also be bringing in a 2-inch vacuum hose that will sit off to the side here that will suck away all the debris as it's being drilled. So I'm going to go ahead and drill these, and just a piece of advice for you guys, if you're going to be using one of these, I prefer to drill halfway through, flip the board, and then drill through and have them meet in the middle. I just find it works much better. So that's it. I'm going to go ahead and drill these tires, and I'll see you back here in a bit. All of the circle cutting is done, and all knuckles intact. We've got all 7 wheels, and there's a trailer that goes with this project. That's why there's 7. But the next step now that I'll be taking in making these wheels will be to use a 1/4-inch roundover bit and round these off. Now this is kind of a tricky process. So this would be one that will be used with the router table, holding down these wheels with push pads, keeping fingers well away from that roundover bit. So I'm going to go ahead and round over both sides of these wheels, and then I'll come back. I've got all 7 wheels rounded over with the 1/4-inch roundover bit, and I've just given them a light sanding. So you can see them here. This is the way they look now. And the next stage now is we have to take these wheels and line them up with our jig so that we can see exactly where it is that we need to drill our holes in our jig to make this whole thing come together. So we're going to align this now, and I'll show you how we're going to go about that. So I've got a piece of 1/8-inch hardboard here, and the only reason this is here is just to emulate the top surface of the router table. And these are the side pieces for my jig, or at least one of them. This piece will go in here as such. Now, the object here now is to line up this wheel so that it is touching our mock-up router table. And once we get it touching the mock-up router table, then I'll need to drill a hole in here for a bolt to hold this particular wheel in place. I can also see that because of the height here, this wheel gets rotated and aligned with an index mark on the jig. But I can see that this jig already is too tall. I'm going to have to adjust this. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up my wheel here, and mark for my hole and drill the hole for my 1/4-inch bolt that will go through my jig to hold my wheel in place while they're being routed. I've got the 1/4-inch hole drilled through the jig, and I've also bolted one of the wheels onto it, and you can see here I've just taken off one side of the jig for clarity, but you can see in these couple pictures that indeed the wheel does ride on the mock-up router table. So now I need to cut the proper height of this jig, and then once I get the height cut, then of course I can glue it together, and then once it's dried up we can move on to the next step. And with that, the jig is glued up, and I'll just cut away here. There you go. You can see there it's all clamped up. I've used some braces with the same angles to hold it together just to help me out in clamping there. It's not the prettiest job in the world, but I'll clean up all the glue off of that afterwards. And for now we're at a standstill, so we're going to wait until the glue dries on this jig, and then we'll get back to it and I'll continue with how the wheels are made on my Jeep build. Okay, and we're back. It's been a week since I was last filming this video, so this jig has had plenty of time to dry up. I've taken a chisel to cut away some of the squeeze out. It's still not that pretty, but more importantly it's square and it has the proper angle on the front that I would like. So at this point in time now, I think I'm going to start doing some test cuts and trying to set it up on the router table. It needs a little bit of a sanding, which I'll also take care of. So I'm going to sand this up, and then we're going to take it over to the router table, set the router up with a 1/8 inch round bit, and then we're going to go from there and see how we make out with this. I've sanded the jig, and another thing that I've done here, and some may find this to be maybe silly or whatever, but I've taken an old drawer knob and I've actually mounted it in the middle of the jig. And the reason for that is I'm going to have to be running this thing into a router bit back and forth, and there's really nowhere to grab a hold of it, and the last thing I want to do is to be grabbing around the front and having to pull it back with a spinning router bit right down in front of it. So I've added this little knob. Silly or not, my fingers are protected. You got to think about these things. So there you go, a little bit of a knob on there to help you use the jig. So now we're going to get over there and set it up, but before I do that I'm going to have to make an indexing template. So let's show you what that's all about. I've made the template, and what this template entails basically is it's a 2 7/8 of an inch circle. I made it out of 1/8 inch hardboard, and I've cut grooves in it, 30 of them, all of them spaced at 12 degrees apart. And the purpose for this indexing jig is to mark my indexing points on the wheel so that as I'm turning it, I can line up each mark with an indexing pin on the jig so that each tread is routed at 12 degrees apart. And I'll just show you how I use this to mark it out, and then we're gonna move on from there. So with this jig, what I've done is I've bolted it to one of my tires, and I've marked a starting point in the jig with a little arrow, and with a 0.5 pencil I'm just going to go in each of these grooves and mark each one of my indexing points, and we're just going to keep marking them all the way around the wheel until we get them done all the way around, and then I'll show you what that looks like. And there we can see that the one wheel has got all the index markings on the one side. Now for this particular instance I only need to mark the one side, because when I route the opposite side of the tire, what will happen is I will use the existing routes for an index point. So I'm going to go ahead and mark the other 6 of these wheels with all of these 30 indexing marks. All 7 wheels are now marked up with their indexing marks, and I tell you, the little marking jig here really made short work of that. So if you're going to make one of these, take the extra time and go that route with the marking jig. But here's our jig, and I just have to install some rails on the router table in order to make it work correctly. But essentially what we've got is a wheel gets bolted onto the front. Now it's on there snug, but not so snug that you can't turn it. And what we've done is the center line of our bolt has been transferred onto the top of our jig, and that line gets aligned with one of the index marks. Then this particular jig is run through into the router. You make your one cut, and then you rotate it to line up to your next indexing mark, 12 degrees, either clockwise or counterclockwise. It doesn't matter because they're all going to get done. And then you run that through the jig. And you carry on with that until all 30 are done. So I'm going to set up the router table and start the process of routing these, and we'll carry on from that point. Well, this is a pretty barbaric setup that I've got here, but it works. What we've got is my initial jig here that you can see. I've got the handle on it for sliding back and forth in these 2 rustic tracks that I've got clamped and angle bracket and screwed to the back fence. Now this back fence here, of course, I've got some pieces of plywood on here, and that will be my depth stop. So when the routing goes in so far, it's only going to hit those stops and not going to allow me to route right through. This particular jig is using a 1/8 inch round tip bit, and I've got it set at 3/16 inch proud of the tabletop. I'll just show you here what that bit looks like, and there you go. I actually had to run out and get one like this today because my other one, turns out it was the wrong size. But hey, live and learn, no biggie. Anyway, so the object here is that I'm going to route one pass till I hit the stop, and then reverse it out of the router, and then rotate once to the next index mark on my jig. And I'll just show you another picture of that just from the back view so you can see what I'm looking at. And there it is there. And then once I get that one routed, I will rotate once again to the next index mark, and so forth and so on. I'll just carry on routing. So let's go ahead and do that and see what we end up with. And we're gonna have to stop that one at this point. Guys, after doing all the filming and editing, I saw the final length of this video and thought it best to cut it into 2 segments. So sorry to keep you waiting, but you're gonna have to wait till next week for part 2 of how to make the Jeep wheels. So thanks for watching up until this point, and I'll see you next week with the continuation of this woodworking video.